These parks are more than just places to relax. They're natural wonders that showcase the most stunning landscapes on the planet. Join me, we're counting down 15 of the most spectacular parks on Earth. Starting with number 15, Ibirapuera Park. When it comes to urban green spaces in South America, nothing quite matches Ibirapuera Park. It's built in the style of an English landscaped garden, and it was established in 1954 in the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo to celebrate the city's 400th anniversary. It now adds a touch of greenery to this dense city, and it's become so popular that it welcomes about 15 million people every single year. Number 14, Torres del Paine National Park. Chile is well known for its long coastline, good food, and right-wing dictators. Although I think I'd say that the beautiful Torres del Paine National Park should get a bit more recognition. Situated in southern Chilean Patagonia, it's known for its mountains, glaciers, lakes, and rivers. It's also home to incredible species like pumas, rheas, guanacos, and crested caracaras. Given the park's beauty, it should come as no surprise that it receives more than 300,000 visitors a year. Number 13, Park Güell. Barcelona is a city that's like no other, and Park Güell is one of its highlights. Built between 1900 and 1914, it was originally meant to be private. Commissioned by Count Eusebi Güell, the idea was for it to be a self-contained residence for 60 wealthy families. In making the park, Antonio Gaudí created a mystical fantasy land-like of homes and buildings. However, despite the hype, Gaudí failed to sell any houses. As a result, the complex was turned into a municipal park in 1924. In 1984, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and today, it is an incredible place to walk through. Number 12, Villa Borghese. If you want to be somewhere that's the epicenter of Italian culture and class, I'd suggest taking a trip down to Villa Borghese in Rome. Located in the northwest of the touristic center, the villa was once owned by the powerful Borghese family. Turned into an expansive art gallery and garden, it holds pieces from legendary Italian maestros like Gian Lorenzo Bernini and Michelangelo Caravaggio. While it used to be private, in 1901 the city finally bought the entire complex and opened it up to the public. Today, while the indoor art exhibits can be accessed for a fee, the gardens themselves are entirely free to enter and make for an incredible public park. Number 11, the Freeway Park. So most parks are built to make urban areas a little greener. Freeway Park doesn't exactly do that. Holding the title of being the first park built atop a freeway, this urban space is an ode to the brutalist architecture of the 1970s and was built to celebrate America's 200th birthday. While originally intended to heal the scar the interstate highway created through the city, it hasn't been that successful. While trees were planted within it, most of them have died due to the pollution, and today it's become a hotspot of crime and vandalism. While this makes it far from spectacular, it is a unique concept, and it earns a spot on this list. Number 10, Iguazu Falls National Park. While Iguazu Falls may not have the name recognition of Niagara Falls in North America or Victoria Falls in Africa, a visit here doesn't disappoint. That's because Iguazu Falls National Park is home to a dizzying array of 275 individual waterfalls. It's not only the world's largest waterfall system, but it's also so impressive that it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's situated on the border between Brazil and Argentina. It expands across a width of about 2.5 kilometers. The falls are split about 20/80 by Brazil and Argentina respectively, and a visit to each side has its own pros and cons. Supposedly, the views from the Brazilian side are considered to be the most panoramic and beautiful. However, the trails and vantage points on the Argentinian side are a lot more up close and personal. Regardless of what side you're looking at though, the most popular point of interest is the Devil's Throat. This is an 80-meter tall and 150-meter wide waterfall that accounts for about half the total water flow through the system. Well, in any case, if you're not scared to get a little wet, there are a few cool activities you can do while you're at Iguazu. Some of the most thrilling include jet boat tours, which take you extremely close to the falls, and cliff rappelling excursions, which allow you to travel down a cliff face to the bottom. If that's not your thing, you can instead opt for jungle or helicopter tours, both of which are quite scenic. So, no matter what type of activity you enjoy, you're going to have something to do at Iguazu Falls National Park. Number 9. High Park. Of all the parks in Toronto, High Park is one of the city's most impressive. It first got its start in 1836 when a man by the name of John George Howard purchased a 65-hectare property in the county of York, west of Toronto. There, he built a sheep farm and cottage and lived there with his wife. Due to its location on the highest point of the Humber Bay shoreline, he named the place High Park and lived there for decades. As Toronto began to grow, developments like railways and homes began to expand into the area around High Park, and it was under these conditions that in 1873 Howard and his wife agreed to convey their property to the city of Toronto. There were several conditions attached to this conveyance. This included provisions that allowed the Howards to continue to live at the cottage, a demand that an annual pension of about maybe $40,000 in today's money can be paid, and a promise that no alcohol be served on the premises. While there was some debate, City Council ultimately voted in favor of these provisions, thereby allowing Hyde Park to become city property. In the years since, it's become an integral part of Toronto's park system. Further additions have expanded its total area from 65 to 161 hectares, and over the years, a bunch of cool features like the playgrounds, a skating rink, and a zoo have been built. But perhaps the most interesting of these is the massive wooden playground in the southeast corner of the park. Assembled by volunteers in 1999, the original was made of wood and had a castle theme with some swings. However, in March of 2012, the original was destroyed when it was burned down in an act of arson. In response, famous TV renovation host Mike Holmes rebuilt it a few months later. The resulting structure is even bigger and better than the last one, and it's easily one of the most beloved family spots in the city. Number 8. The Serengeti National Park. Of all the national parks out there, Serengeti is easily one of the most iconic. Located in northern Tanzania, it stretches for an area roughly equivalent to about 19 New York cities stretched end to end. Founded back in 1930, it became a natural park in 1940, and it ultimately became a strictly protected national park in 1948. While this process wasn't perfect, after all, the local Maasai people had their movements restricted, and eventually a deal was reached between the tribe and the government. Serengeti is famous because of its annual animal migration. It's the largest animal migration in the world. Every year, more than 1.3 million wildebeests and 600,000 plain zebras and Thompson gazelles make their way across the park. Their movement is based on the wet and dry seasons. With the onset of the short rains of November, the wildebeest herds move southeast, staying there until the long rains end in May. As the rains diminish, the herds head northwest towards their dry season range. Resident lions, spotted hyenas, and other big carnivores cull the hordes. Intense river crossings, including of the crocodile-filled Mara River in the north, are incredibly dramatic. It's thanks to these migrations that Serengeti is the largest lion population and either the first or second largest hyena population in the world. Serengeti is also home to many other famous animals, including leopards, rhinos, cheetahs, and hippopotamus. Now, while this makes it a great place to visit, it also puts it under threat. That's because many of these animals here are facing endangerment. One of the Serengeti's biggest issues is poaching. You see, many animals in the park are known for being trophy animals or for having parts that are useful in traditional medicines. This in turn leads to them being picked off, usually for thousands of dollars apiece. Now, to put things into perspective, the numbers aren't great. For example, it's not uncommon for 125,000 of the park's 1.3 million wildebeests to be poached in a single year. Now, beyond direct poaching, animals in the park are also threatened by deforestation, population growth, and ranching, but thankfully efforts are underway to ensure that these issues don't grow out of control, and hopefully they're enough. If you'd like to visit, the Serengeti has plenty of hotel operators that are going to take your money and take you out onto the savannah and a safari trek, be it on foot, by car, or something else in between. This, in turn, makes it a great vacation destination. Moving on to number 7, Banff National Park. Banff National Park is integral to Canada's identity, and the area has been the site of a lot of historic developments. First and foremost, First Nations groups have lived there for millennia. Archaeological evidence suggests that there has been a human presence there for over 10,000 years. However, it first caught the interest of the Canadian government in the 1870s. Canadian authorities hoped to build a railroad through the area and chose Kicking Horse Pass as the route. This pass moves through Banff, and so as railroad officials began to survey the area, they noted its beauty. The discovery of a natural springs here led to further talks of development, and in 1885 the springs were preserved by the federal government, and in 1887 the national park was created. The Canadian Pacific Railway took advantage of this conservation status quickly, building the Banff Springs Hotel and Lake Louise Chalet to attract tourists and visitors to increase the number of rail passengers. What they were enjoying was a park with few rivals. It's located in the Rocky Mountains. It's got an array of biomes that include mountainous terrain, dense carnivorous forests, expansive glaciers and ice fields, and beautiful alpine landscapes. In particular, Lake Louise is perhaps the most popular destination. Its turquoise blue water makes it a great place to paddle on or canoe or go for a swim. The area is known to be a great place to go hiking too. It's filled with numerous trails that go across 3 different ecoregions. But if exploring isn't your thing, you can take advantage of the great skiing. Open from November until May, Banff has one of the longest ski seasons in North America. Now, while the old-timer travelers were quite wealthy, it is now possible to travel Banff on a bit more of a budget. More than 4 million people visit this park each year, and it's now possible to get everything from hostel accommodations to incredibly luxurious resorts. This in turn makes Banff a must-visit. It's also worth noting that Banff's history isn't completely positive. It's got a dark side that's not often discussed. During the development of the park in the late 1800s and early 1900s, several First Nations groups were forcibly removed in an effort to open up more space for tourists and sportsmen. If that wasn't bad enough, during World War I, Banff acted as an internment camp. Thousands of immigrants from Austria-Hungary, Germany, Ukraine, and various Slavic countries were forcibly sent to work there, where in prison-like conditions they labored for incredibly meager pay. It's these laborers that created much of the park's infrastructure, much of which still stands today. Number 6. Gardens by the Bay. When it comes to urban parks, few are quite as spectacular or futuristic as the Gardens by the Bay. It's located in Singapore. This park was built in an attempt to beautify the marina and help transform the dense city-state into a city in the garden. I'd say that they succeeded. The area's most defining feature is its collection of 18 super trees, with heights ranging from 24 to 48 meters and light displays that come alive at night. While they would perhaps seem a bit out of place in many other cities, the super urban atmosphere is the perfect setting, as they add a distinctive flair to the skyline. Of course, these aren't trees in a traditional sense, they're just buildings that look like trees, but inside each one, you get an incredible dose of nature. Each one has tons of plants and green tech on the inside. Roughly 200 species of orchids, ferns, and other tropical climbers scale these super tree trunks, forming a lush, colorful skin. 11 of the trees are outfitted with either solar panels, which provide power, or ventilation systems, which capture exhaust from the park's greenhouses. The trees do put on quite the show. Every night at 7:45 and 8:45 p.m., the Super Tree Grove comes alive with a coordinated light music show known as the Garden Rhapsody. The accompanying music to the show changes every month or so, with selected themes such as A World of Wonder and A Night of Musical Theater, all being part of its repertoire. While the super trees certainly steal the show, they're not the only thing to visit at Gardens by the Bay. The garden complex is also home to 2 enormous greenhouses. Buildings like the Flower Dome support thousands of varieties of cool, dry climate plants and flowers, while the nearby Cloud Forest fosters plants that prefer wet conditions. Both of these greenhouses use sustainable technology to minimize their impact, and in turn, they're a must-visit for those with a green thumb or a love of nature. Number 5. Hyde Park. For centuries, London sat as the head of the expansive British Empire, and like many capitals of its era, it was home to a royal family, and for a time, that family had private control over Hyde Park. You see, before the days of public land, green spaces outside palaces were generally used for royal recreation. Acquired from the monks of Westminster Abbey in 1536, King Henry VIII bought the land for use as a hunting ground. More specifically, he enclosed the area and used it as a deer park. In 1619, it was opened up to the nobility, and in 1636 it was finally made a completely public space by King Charles I. This wouldn't last for long, though. Just 16 years later, it was sold, and then later taken back by King Charles II. However, it was later returned to its status as a public park. During the Elizabethan era, it was a popular spot for May Day parades, although it really rose to prominence in the 1700s. It was during this time that a lot of landscaping was done, turning the once tree-filled hunting expanse into one that could be used for picnics and other public leisure. This transition made it a popular spot for duels. A total of 172 duels took place during the 1700s, and this is not to mention the fact that it was a favorite spot for public executions. Thankfully, though, the 1800s were far less dark. The century kicked off when Hyde Park hosted a great fair in the summer of 1814. This fair was run to celebrate the Allied victory over Napoleon. There were various stalls and shows, including a reenactment of the Battle of Trafalgar in the park's lake. The coronation of King George IV was also celebrated in the park, with the event including an air balloon and firework display. Yet it was in 1851 that a truly incredible event was hosted, the Great Exhibition. Hosted inside a magnificent, albeit temporary glass building known as the Crystal Palace, it showcased the British Empire by showing off its industry, technology, and culture. Throughout the 1900s and 2000s, the park has become increasingly democratized and regularly hosts concerts, speeches, and the occasional Royal Jubilee. In today's day and age, it's also been attached to Kensington Gardens, which are a beautiful expanse that's open to the public. On a visit to London, both Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens are a must-see. They're a great place to walk, bike, or otherwise enjoy a nice day. There's also several important landmarks in Hyde Park. These include the Hyde Park Rose Garden, the Rangers Lodge, and the Speaker's Corner, where free speech of all kind is encouraged, and where figures such as William Morris, Karl Marx, and Vladimir Lenin have all spoken to an audience. So if you want a park that's truly incredible, Hyde Park can't be missed. Number 4. Tiergarten. In the 1520s, the Elector of Brandenburg set aside the Tiergarten for a popular noble activity, hunting. It was sectioned off from the rest of Berlin. It was fenced, filled in with wild animals such as deer, and used for recreational hunts. Over time, the grounds began to change. In 1695, the first king of Prussia, Frederick I, had the First Avenue constructed within the Tiergarten, connecting the royal capital and the newly constructed summer palace, Schloss Charlottenburg. Over time, hunting began to fall out of practice as the local German noblemen began to put their eye towards other interests. Frederick the Great was one such noble. In 1740, he opened the park's first public gardens, and in 1742, the fences torn down and Tiergarten turned into a public garden open to the people of Berlin. In a move that was rather enlightened for the time, he also created a series of salons. Located near the walkways, these were areas partitioned off with hedges and trees and furnished with seating, fountains, and vases. The idea behind these areas were to give people places to discuss intellectual and political matters in private. In Europe, where heavy censorship was the norm, this was perhaps the pinnacle of free speech. Since then, Tiergarten Park has been redesigned a number of times, with the most significant changes coming between 1833 and 1849. In this major makeover, a leading landscape gardener drew his inspiration from English models to transform the grounds into the type of English-style park that was popular at the time. Throughout the 1800s and 1900s, an increasing number of nationalist monuments were erected to celebrate German culture. The park was transformed from royal ownership to ownership under the city of Berlin, providing an additional public element. In order to help support the citizens of Berlin, most of the trees here were chopped down for firewood. Of the over 200,000 that once stood, just 700 were maintained. The empty fields were then turned into temporary farmland by order of British troops. Around 2,500 plots of land were made available for growing potatoes and vegetables. Despite the destruction, things eventually stabilized, and in 1949 a 10-year-long tree replanting effort began. In total, 250,000 saplings were planted with the help of donations. Today, the Tiergarten has a lot of cool monuments that have been built over the years. Close to the Brandenburg Gate, you can find the Soviet War Memorial and the Global Stone Peace Project. Further into the park, you can find the Office of the Federal President and the Victory Column. However, if you decide to visit, be warned that the Tiergarten is absolutely massive. It's got a surface area of about 2.5 square kilometers, so be sure to set aside a large chunk of time so you can truly appreciate all it has to offer. Number 3. Parc Monceau. When people visit Paris, they tend to hit top spots like the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, and the Louvre. But for those who are willing to go off the beaten path to the city's north end are in for a treat, as it's here that they can find Parc Monceau. Established by King Louis XVI's cousin in 1769, it was built to be an entertainment venue of sorts. More specifically, he constructed the pavilion alongside a 12-hectare park. This park featured a variety of amusements, including an Egyptian pyramid, a minaret, a Gothic castle, a Dutch mill, false ruins, and rivers. It also contained a vast English garden. The intention of the park was to surprise and amaze visitors. As written by a designer, it's not necessary for the gardens or nature to be presented in the most agreeable forms. The true art is to know how to keep the visitors there through a variety of objects, otherwise they'll go to a real countryside to find what should be found in this garden, the image of liberty. The site was more or less completed in 1779. However, Philip would only get to enjoy it for about 15 years. While he was a supporter of the ideals of the French Revolution and even voted, as a member of the Assembly, for the execution of his own cousin, Louis XVI, it didn't save him from the Revolution's wrath. He was guillotined during the Reign of Terror in 1793 as the park was nationalized. However, the nationalization was short-lived. After the monarchy was restored in 1814, the park was returned to Philip's relatives. During the Second Empire, the family sold lots within the park to real estate developers. Now, this reduced the size of the park by about half. These sales also led to the destruction of many of the fantasy buildings that he had built. Thankfully, though, the city of Paris did a good job improving the park. Under Baron Haussmann's grand transformation of the city, he updated it. He created an ornamental gate, new pavilions, several pathways, and a beautiful bridge. He preserved most of the follies remaining from the original gardens and integrated them into the space alongside additions of exotic trees and flowers from around the world. Now, it is worth mentioning that the park has also been the site of many interesting events. Perhaps the most historic happened in 1797, when André-Jacques Gonorin performed the world's first parachute jump. He leapt from a Montgolfier hot air balloon, landing in the park where a large crowd was gathered. A more tragic event happened in 1871. Following the downfall of Napoleon and subsequent uprising, the then crushing of the Paris Commune, the park was used by army troops to put down those who supported the Commune. Yet, despite the ups and downs, the park has been immortalized in a positive way. This, in turn, has helped give the park a worldwide reputation for beauty and elegance. Number 2. Central Park. Few public spaces are as iconic as New York Central Park. It's located between the Upper West Side and Upper East Side neighborhoods of Manhattan. This massive expanse of green space has a storied history. In the 1840s, New York was huge, and soon a consortium of wealthy merchants and landowners were upset. They wanted New York to compete with the likes of London and Paris. And so, in order to begin doing that, they had to have a massive green space to cement its international reputation. Beyond being big and beautiful, there were also some philanthropic intentions. After all, at this time, it was common for the working poor to frequent saloons and get drunk while not at work. Central Park gave them a healthier, natural escape from the concrete jungle. It was due to these interests that in 1853, the New York State Legislature used the power of eminent domain to force the sale of more than 700 acres of land in the center of Manhattan. This terrain was mostly uninhabited. After all, it was an irregular terrain of swamps, bluffs, and rocky outcroppings, making housing development far from ideal. There were also many people who already lived there. The creation of the park displaced about 1,600 poor workers who lived in shanties on the site. Once the park was raised, it was ready for development. In order to find a good layout, a design competition was held. Out of 33 entries, the commission selected the Greenwards Plan, submitted by writer and farmer Frederick Law Olmsted and architect Calvert Vaux. The plan was naturalistic. It featured a large pastoral landscape and wooded areas, both of which could provide New Yorkers with a rural respite from the city. Construction began in 1858. In the process, workers moved nearly 4 million cubic meters of stone, earth, and topsoil, built 36 bridges and arches, and constructed 11 overpasses. They also planted over 500,000 trees, shrubs, and vines, giving the park a natural feel. All in all, it was a huge success. Only months after the design competition was completed, the first section of the park, the lake, was open to the public. The other parts of Central Park were built gradually, and all in all, the cost came to about $14 million. Today, that would amount to over $270 million. At first, the park was mostly used by the wealthy. However, it wasn't long until it was frequented by the middle and lower classes. This led to increased visitor traffic. Now, while this should have been a good thing, for a variety of reasons, both political corruption and public demands led to less money being spent on the maintenance of the park. Soon, it entered a steep decline. By the early 1900s, dead plants were not being replaced. The soil was eroding and the pathways and waterways were clogged. Yet things were about to get better. In 1934, Mayor LaGuardia appointed Robert Moses as the New York City Parks Commissioner. He soon got to work revitalizing the park. Things were on the up and up until Moses' resignation in 1960, and from then on, the park faced a slow decline. A 1973 report noted that the park suffered from severe erosion and tree decay, and that individual structures were being vandalized or neglected. In light of this fall from grace, New York authorities realized that something had to be done. After the 73 report, the Central Park Community Fund was created. This fund was used to fix up the park, restoring it to its former glory. The Community Fund evolved over time, eventually becoming the Central Park Conservancy. Now, while the name may have changed, the mission continues, and it's thanks to their hard work that Central Park is a place that tourists and New Yorkers can continue to enjoy today. Number 1. Stanley Park. Of all Vancouver's landmarks, few are as iconic as Stanley Park. It's considered to be one of the world's largest urban parks. It's so immense that it's 20% larger than New York's Central Park. It's also got a unique history. Prior to the arrival of British colonizers, Stanley Park was the traditional home of the Coast Salish First Nations. Now, when I say traditional, I really mean that. After all, artifacts have been found in the park that are more than 3,200 years old. Up until colonization, it was actively used. It was home to hundreds of First Nations people and was located on the park's premises. However, it was the city of Vancouver that began to grow in population. The inhabitants of a village faced increased pressure, ultimately, and they were forced to flee in 1887 after city officials destroyed the village. In the wake of the colonial destruction came a silver lining, the opening of Stanley Park. Around the year 1860, settlers began to move into the area, cohabitating with nearby indigenous peoples. As gold mining booms began further north, more people moved into the area, and soon the government began to have an interest in securing the land for themselves. In 1863, the land in what is now Stanley Park was surveyed for military use as a reserve. This saved it from development, as being put on the military registry meant that very few of the area's precious trees could be chopped down. While the First Nations peoples were removed, European settlers were not evicted until about 50 years later, and ultimately people continued to live in Stanley Park until 1958. Yet all of these people didn't lead to much in the way of destruction. After all, while the park has a trail around it and several trails through it, it's mostly untouched forest land. Named after Lord Stanley, who had recently become Canada's 6th Governor-General, the park quickly became popular amongst the locals. In order to facilitate its use, the city of Vancouver made a few improvements. First and foremost, the city constructed a perimeter road around the peninsula right before the park's opening. They then progressively began to add more amenities, including a zoo, aquarium, athletics fields, ornamental ponds, paths, bridges, and beaches. However, the most notable improvement of them all was the creation of an 8.5-kilometer-long seawall that surrounds the park. Building it was a massive effort. It was done in small chunks, and it took more than 60 years to complete. Construction began in 1914 and ended in 1980. The seawall was important because erosion was eating away at the park. It also led to a lot more park usage, and today millions of visitors enjoy walking, cycling, and inline skating along the seawall. In the First World War, it was feared that German submarines stationed in China could attack Vancouver. To deter such an attack, military officials installed 2 4-inch caliber guns on the park's coast. While they were in service for about a year, they were ultimately decommissioned after the Navy decided German submarines were no longer a threat. In the Second World War, the Department of National Defense worried about Japanese attacks. To defend against them, they installed 2 6-inch caliber coastal defense guns in the park, along with spotlights positioned at various points. They remained in operation until early 1945, and parts of the park remained under military control until 1948. In modern times, though, the far more serious threat to the park's longevity has been storms. In the period from 1900 to 1960, 19 separate windstorms struck the park, some with enough force to take down thousands of trees. In the 20th century, 2 substantial storms altered the forest of Stanley Park, one in 1934 and another in 1962. Yet perhaps the worst storm in the park's history came in 2006. Thanks to ferocious winds, thousands of trees were leveled. In response, a new forest management plan was adopted in 2010, and ever since, the park has shown signs of recovery. Thanks for watching, everybody. Click here to watch the next video, the top 15 largest abandoned amusement parks. Thank you to our channel members.